All right, everyone. I guess now we better kick off. Let me get rid of this. All right. For those who haven't already scanned in, please scan in on your mobile device or go to this website for some interactive polling during this presentation. So we'd, on behalf of the ANGMA Society, we'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians, traditional owners and custodians. Can you mute Marlene? Thank you. Of the lands on which we meet today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. We acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded, and that the land that we live, work, and learn on always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So a little bit of housekeeping to begin. For those here in the audience, the bathrooms are just out the back to the left in the foyer, and the emergency exits, there's two at the front and also two at the rear. And also just a very brief disclaimer that any statements made during today's presentation or during question time should not be taken as medical advice. Please always seek guidance from your doctor or other qualified health professional for any questions you may have regarding your own health or a medical condition. So now we can get started, and it's really my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this public lecture on brains, bugs and bowels, the inner workings of your inner self. And this is brought to you by the ANGMA Society, which is a group of scientists, researchers and clinicians who are passionate about gut health. So just to give you an overview of today's presentation, we're going to have three presentations from three really eminent and very exciting speakers who work in the field of gut health. We'll be starting with Professor Felice Jacka, who'll be talking to you about food and mood. And then Associate Professor Andrew Holmes will be talking to you about having a good relationship with your microbiome. And then finally, Dr. Erin Shanahan will be talking to us about interventions around the gut, including poo transplants. But my name is Lincon Stamp, and I'm from the University of Melbourne, and it's my job tonight to introduce you to your gut. So the gut is a really complex tissue within the body that has many, many really important functions. It's the most exposed and fragile, sorry, that's not the word, the most exposed surface of our body to the outside world. That includes the skin. And it has kind of two different kind of roles. On one hand, you need your gut to be both accessible and permeable, so you can consume food and then also absorb nutrients and water from that food that you consume. But at the same time, your gut needs to be able to protect your body from dangerous chemicals or pathogens such as viruses that you might consume. And you can see here, we zoom inside the gut, that it's a really complex tissue made up of many different cell types and many different layers. So for those of you who haven't already, please scan the QR code, and we're going to have our first poll everywhere question. This is for everyone in person and online. If you've missed the QR code, you can go to this website up here. So the first question I want to ask you guys and get everyone's thoughts on is, how long do you think your gut is? So from this end all the way through to the other end, how long do you think your gut is? And I'll give you guys a few minutes to punch in your results. Minutes is a stretch, a few seconds. All right, it's probably long enough. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, so of the 10 people who've responded, 50% say 10 meters and 50% say 100 meters. And the correct answer, actually, the correct answer is about 10 meters. So there's 10 meters of gut crammed into this space here. So if we were to unravel it, it would probably reach from one side of the room to the other. So you might ask, why is our gut so long? Why do we need so much intestine crammed into such a small space? And that's because the gut plays many really, really important roles in our normal function and physiology. These include, as I mentioned before, providing a physical barrier to the outside world, As we consume the food, the gut then has to mix that, it has to break it down and then push it all the way through your bowel. And I think one of the most important roles that the gut plays, obviously, is detecting and then absorbing the nutrients and the water from the food and liquid that we consume. And it's this nutrients and water that gives us the energy to drive our everyday activities. But there are also other important functions the gut does, which is secrete enzymes to break down that food. And also importantly, they do secrete hormones. And some of these hormones are actually the hormones that tell us when we're hungry and also when we're full. So now I want to introduce you to some of the key players in the gut. So if we zoom right into your gut here and look on the inside of your gut, we can see all these different cell types that play really key roles in your normal gut function. Over here, you can see the blood vessels, which are important for taking up hormones and nutrients from the food that you eat and carrying them around the body, up to your brain, to your muscles, to your other organs to give them the energy to function. You have this epithelial layer here, which you can see form these finger-like projections in the bowel. And these are important because they give the bowel an impenetrable barrier so that food and content doesn't just pass from the inside of your gut into your body and into your bloodstream, but it's done in a really, really controlled way. Some of these specialized epithelial cells in this layer also produced hormones, some of those that I mentioned, including ones that tell you when you're hungry or when you're full. Another important population of cells is immune cells, and these are the cells that really monitor the health of your gut and monitor the integrity of this epithelial layer, and will tell you if there's a disruption and help activate inflammation, which can be both a good and also, as we know, a very bad thing. Another important player in the gut is what we call the enteric nervous system, or the second brain in the gut. And this is an extensive network of neurons which resides within your gut wall and goes all the way from your esophagus, in your stomach, and all the way down into your small and your large intestines. And these nerves play really key roles in controlling most of these gut physiology functions, including how you absorb nutrients, how you absorb water, and how you detect those things as well. But the final thing I want to tell you about is everyone's favorite, the gut microbiome. So you can see these down here. Everyone usually thinks about the gut microbiome exclusively as bacteria, but actually there are as many, if not more, viruses in your gut, and there's also fungi, and these are supposed to be there. It's when you get an imbalance in these viral fungi and bacteria, that's when things start to go wrong, and Andrew and Erin are going to tell us a bit about that, as well as Felice. So now our next poll everywhere question is, how many microbes do you think there are in your large intestine? So we've already got 39 results. That's good. We're off to a flyer. All right, that's probably long enough. This is always fun to watch people change their opinion to fit the poll as well. So 43% say 40 billion. And amazingly, the correct answer actually is 40 trillion. There are 40 trillion microbes just in your large intestine. So if you think about that, that's many, many more microbes in your large intestine than there are human cells in your entire body, which raises the question is, who is actually controlling who here? And actually, did you know that you can transfer one person's microbes into another person? For instance, someone with happy, smiley microbes, their microbes can be transferred into someone with cranky microbes that give them gut problems. And this is done through a process called fecal microbiota transplants or poo transplantation. And as I said, Erin and Felice are also going to be talking about that a little bit more in detail later. So one last poll everywhere question is, would you consider, and not just for funsies, if a doctor suggested it, would you consider getting a poo transplant? I want to get to triple digits. Come on, poll results. All right, that's probably enough. Oh, that's exciting and I guess unsurprising. People interested in gut health probably have done a bit of a reading around this space already, but that's really exciting to hear that people are open to this. But again, I think Erin will probably touch on this. This is something which is an exciting area of research, But as far as clinical application, there's probably only a few disorders where it's actually advised, and one disorder where it's the frontline treatment for that particular disease. So a really exciting space to watch. So that's me wrapping up the introduction to your gut. And before I pass on to our first speaker, I just want to say I hope that you take away from today's speakers that you want to keep your gut happy. Keeping your gut happy can have not just a huge impact on your physical well-being, but also your mental well-being. And what you eat and how you eat is going to play a huge role in that. And that will be perfect timing to pass it on to our next speaker, Professor Felice Jacka, who's going to be talking to us about food and mood related things. Thanks, Felice.
Thanks so much, Lincon, and thanks for inviting me today. I really enjoy hanging out with gastroenterologists. It's not something I expected to find myself doing. I certainly hang out with a lot of psychiatrists, but not gastroenterologists. So please don't ask me any really, really tricky questions about the gut. I'll just tell you to ask Lincon because I won't be able to answer them. And indeed, I actually feel often a bit of a fraud at the moment because I'm often called on to speak about the gut and its possible importance in mental and brain health. But the truth is that because of COVID, so much of our research where we really hope to generate a lot of data and answer a lot of questions has been put on hold. So I think it'll be very, very interesting to watch the work that comes out of our Food and Mood Centre over the next 12 or 18 months or 2 years, because we do hope to be able to at least shed light on some of the very outstanding questions. And certainly in the area of the microbiota gut-brain axis, which we think has huge promise. Most of the data thus far are coming from animal studies. So we really do need more human data. But what I'll do now is just give you a bit of an idea about why we would be interested in the gut. And I think you'll understand once we go through this. But I'll start off just by talking about nutritional psychiatry, because that's my field. My background is in psychology and epidemiology and statistics, certainly not microbiology or gastroenterology. But the context that we're living in is this industrialized food environment. Now, this particular report published in 2019, calculated the impact of our industrialised food systems to be upwards of $12 trillion a year. And that's because of its impact on global health and the environment. Now, more recently, I'm in the very honoured position now of working with the World Economic Forum, and their more recent analysis suggests that it's closer to $20 trillion a year. Now, about 11 trillion of that is the impact on global health, because industrialised foods and poor diet and their sequelae, so things like high blood glucose and high blood pressure and high body mass index, they are now the leading killers of people around the globe on average. As well, of course, is this impact on the environment. So this is the leading cause of early mortality, this industrialised food system. But then we also have this huge burden of mental disorders. It's absolutely massive, despite an amazing amount of effort focused on reducing stigma and increasing access to treatment, certainly in places like Australia. Over the last 1 or 2 decades, we have not seen any improvement in the population prevalence of these disorders. It depends on how you calculate it, but certainly many calculations suggest that mental disorders account for the leading cause of global disability. And the biggest chunk of that is made up by what's called the common mental disorders, depression and anxiety. And they've actually only gotten worse through COVID. We haven't had new treatments for them for decades. And the existing treatments, the antidepressants, the psychotherapy, they help maybe fewer than half of the people who access those treatments. And they certainly don't completely help people a lot of the time. So we really need to be thinking about prevention, and we need to be thinking about new ways of treating these mental disorders. And this is where nutritional psychiatry comes in. So nutritional psychiatry that joins these 2 huge causes of global disease burden is focused on research that develops and evaluates nutritional approaches to the prevention and treatment of mental and brain disorders and the physical health problems that go with them, and then the application of that evidence base. And this applies in the clinic, public health and prevention, and policy. Now, the work that we've done has had a big impact. We've been very fortunate. It's informed very large changes to clinical guidelines. It's informed many, many large policy documents and initiatives, and increasingly so. And we're doing a lot of work to bridge that sort of translation gap, getting the research evidence into practice and policy. So there's a lot going on there. What it isn't is complementary medicine, integrative medicine, alternative medicine, functional medicine. These are all things that are perceived to sit alongside real medicine. Now, real medicine, in inverted commas, has a strong scientific evidence base. We know it works, and we know because rigorous randomized controlled trials and other sorts of research is done to show this. Many of these other areas don't have that evidence base, and there's a big problem with misinformation and people assuming that they know. And this includes general practitioners, doctors, psychiatrists who get on average about 2 hours of training in nutrition through their whole medical degree. So what we really focus on at the Food and Mood Centre is generating the very best quality evidence that we possibly can, that helps us to understand the contribution of our diets to our mental and brain health right across the life course. We look at population health, we look at novel clinical interventions, we really want to know more about mechanisms, how things work, and as I said, education and training as well. So we're doing a lot. This is we have a great website if people are interested that they can go and find out lots of blogs and information about the research that we're doing. What we know now, about 12 years since the first major studies in this field have been published, is that diet is linked to mental health right across the life course. So the quality of our diets is linked to our risk for these common mental disorders, particularly depression. This is really where the research is focused thus far. This is not explained by things like education and income. It's not explained by body weight. It's not explained by other health behaviours, and it's also not explained by reverse causality. So people eating differently because they have a mental disorder, although we know that that does happen. There are data from, and this is just a reference to one of the several meta-analyses out there from right around the world. So really the point being that whether you are having, you're sitting in Norway and you're having a traditional Norwegian diet or traditional Japanese diet, traditional Chinese diet, Australian, British, what we know is that traditional types of diets, foods, and that are lower in these industrialized foods and higher in whole versions of foods, plant foods, good quality proteins, good quality fats, fish, things like nuts and legumes, fermented foods, traditional diets. People who have higher intake of these types of foods are about 30 to 35% on average less likely to develop depression. Now, that's very important, particularly when you're considering that 100% of the people in the world eat several times every day, and it's something we can modify. This is really important when we think about prevention. Half of all mental disorders start before the age of 14. It's critical for people to understand that this evidence base covers this early life period where people are at greater risk, such that diet quality is linked to young people's mental health over and over again, independent of all these factors, including familial factors, you know, low socioeconomic status, all sorts of things. When we think about the data, even in Australia, where we have access to all this wonderful food, teenagers are eating on average about 7 serves of discretionary foods, junk foods, a day. And this is because of our industrialized food environment, where we have these foods that are manufactured to interact with all the reward systems in the brain, which is the reward systems very, very activated in adolescence. And it's really affected the way young people are eating as well as everybody else. And it goes right back to the start of life. There are many, many studies showing that what mothers eat during pregnancy and what children eat in the first few years is directly linked to their emotional development, but also even really serious neurocognitive disorders such as ADHD. In Australia, 99% of toddlers don't eat enough vegetables based on the dietary guidelines. You know, it's actually really, I think, a disaster, and it's what gets me out of bed and keeps me doing what I do. We also now have many data from randomised controlled trials. Now, doing randomised controlled trials in psychiatry and with nutrition, it's about as difficult as it gets. We have the wonderful Dr. Heidi Studaker with us, who's in our team, and she's one of the world experts in doing this really, really hard stuff. From these trials, we see over and over again that helping people to improve their diet, to increase their intake of the good stuff and reduce their intake of the bad stuff has a really substantial influence on their mental health, even people who are very severely unwell with clinical depression, and that it's highly cost effective, and that the diet doesn't need to be expensive. It can be cheaper than the junk food diet that people are eating when they start off. And it can really, really help people. So this is really important because, again, when we think about the determinants of mental health problems, they're very often things that are difficult to change. So they're things like our genetics and our early life trauma, life stress, poverty, disadvantage, all of these sorts of things. But we know that lifestyle factors, including diet, are things that we can modify. And this is why it's important to understand this and to really do the research to really get a good handle on it. And one of the things we need to understand, of course, is how does diet and what we eat affect our mental and brain health? Now, this is an expert review that we published a couple of years ago, and I'll just be very brief because I've only got 5 minutes, but we think about things like epigenetics, the way our genes are expressed. Neurogenesis, this very key area of the brain called the hippocampus that's key to learning and memory across the life course. Very important in mental health, highly plastic, very much influenced by what we eat. Inflammation and oxidative stress, our immune system. This is a key player. There's a whole field called psychoneuroimmunology about how the immune system and mental health in the brain talk to each other. Our mitochondria, how they work, our stress response system, part of our neurotransmitter systems. These are all influenced by what we eat, and they all are implicated in depression and many other mental disorders as well. But the gut microbiota is something that links all of them. We know that the gut plays a role in influencing all of these systems. And this is why it's so interesting to us, because when we think about all the factors that affect the microbes that live in our gut, diet is arguably the most important. There's many factors: where we live, our exposure to soil and pets, obviously antibiotics are a major impact, disease, etc. But diet is very important, affecting the microbes that are in our gut, but also what they do. We know, we don't know, we think that the diversity of our gut microbes is important. We don't see this in every study. There's a lot of methodological challenges, but over and over again, we do see that a gut microbiota that is more diverse, that has more different types of bacteria, more evenly spread, is associated with better health outcomes and also associated with better diet. I was just saying to the other panel members earlier that I think the most convincing evidence is coming out of the cancer field, where we have data from large studies of humans showing that the diversity of our guts is linked to our treatment outcomes, whether or not we respond to immunotherapy, but even things like stem cells and chemotherapy. Now, this is incredibly important because it really tells us something about what we need to do to improve our outcomes in cancer. There's actually FMT studies underway at the moment in cancer where they take poo from people who have responded to immunotherapy and put it into people who haven't to see if that can help. We know that people who are exposed to antibiotics within a month or so of receiving immunotherapy are twice as likely to die. Now, that's pretty startling. There's another trial in breast cancer research at the moment where the whole intervention is just half a tin of navy beans a day. That's it, just to increase our fibre. If you think about the diversity of the gut microbiota like a diverse rainforest, it's resilient. And we don't have one particular organism or, situation dominating. We don't know hugely yet about what is important in creating a diverse gut microbiota, but all the evidence we do have suggests that it's about increasing the amount and the diversity of the plant foods that we take in. Because the gut microbes, the main thing they're doing is breaking down the bits of food that our human enzymes can't break down, and that is primarily fibre and polyphenols from plant foods. So the more plants you have, the more diverse your gut microbiota, based on what we know so far. If we think about the changes to our food system and our industrialised food system, and also the biodiversity of the planet around it, it's becoming less and less and less and less diverse, more and more and more processed, and we see this relationship with this massive increase in allergic diseases and also autoimmune diseases and things like MS and rheumatoid arthritis and celiac disease and IBD, even in little children. And our gut not only is very much involved in our immune system as adults, but we think it plays a very important role in kind of setting up our immune system right at the start of life. When people move from traditional societies to the West, their gut microbes become less diverse, and that correlates with an increase in obesity and other markers of chronic disease. This is just a very brief thing that I wanted to bring to light because, and I realise that I'm over time now, but this small trial I think was very useful in pointing something out that people need to consider. If you're living in the West where you get not nearly enough fibre, not nearly enough vegetables, and you don't have the microbes in your gut that can break down fibre, introducing a whole lot of fibre quickly can be really problematic. So in this trial, they were interested to see whether a high fermented foods diet or a high fibre diet or higher was just adding an extra 20 grams a day, that's all, to people's baseline intake of fibre, would reduce inflammation and increase diversity. Now, they found that the fermented foods did, but they found that in those who got the high fibre diet, those who had low diversity to start with, they actually did worse. And they thought, well, maybe it's because they haven't broken down that fibre. And when they looked, they saw that there was undigested fibre in the gut. So that's just a little cautionary tale about proceeding slowly. We have an extensive microbiome research program at the Food and Mood Centre. And again, you can go onto the website and have a good look at that to get more information. The gut microbiota is incredibly complex. The sums that are needed to work out what's going on and who's doing what and is very, very complicated. And the methods that we need to employ to figure this out are really complicated. But actually, based on everything we know so far, what you need to do to have a healthier gut is quite simple. More plants, more diversity of plants, less highly and ultra-processed food, possibly including some fermented foods. The evidence there is still early, but we think that it's likely to be helpful. Start small with sustainable changes. If you'd like to know more, I've got special permission to give my book a plug here. My husband and I wrote this in a sneaky attempt to get kids and their parents and their grandparents and their teachers thinking about their gut and making better food choices. So there's the website if people are interested, and I hope that you found that interesting.
Thanks, Lincon. Sorry, bit over time.
Thanks so much, Felice. A lot of food for thought. Sorry, I had to say it. I forgot to mention as well that we're going to save questions to the end. We're going to have our panel question session at the end. But the people online, you can smash the Q&A whenever you like. So our next speaker is Associate Professor Andrew Holmes. He's going to be talking to us about having a healthy relationship with your gut microbiome. Thanks, Andrew.
Do I need a speaker thing? Or can I? Oh, it's all there. Okay. Thank you, Felice, and thank you all for being here. So I'm at the Charles Perkins Centre at the University of Sydney, where the focus of the the centre is the nutrition-related chronic diseases. So obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes was where we started, but we've moved on, as you have heard now, to almost anything that ties together the way our body system works as a complex adaptive system in terms of response to diet and other stresses. So what I want to do is to give you a little bit of a story about a way of thinking about this that I think is essential to understanding both why our gut microbiome and diet are so important to us, but also what some of the things we need to really think about if we're going to incorporate that into management of disease. And that is to recognise that our microbes really are a part of us. We're a symbiosis with them. And that means that we don't need to think about it as two things separately living together, but really as one organism that's got two parts that interact. And I'd like to tell you a story about this little squid and the bacteria here to give you an idea about how these sorts of marriages come together, because this is something that applies to us as well. So these bacteria here, Vibrio fischeri, something that's found in seawater, particularly in tropical and temperate waters around the world. This little family of bobtail squids, you can find various species of those around the world as well. And they're basically dating partners waiting to come together. And out in the seawater, there's literally millions of different species of bacteria. They don't have access to internet dating sites to come into contact with each other. There's a little bit of randomness here. But as they get close enough together, there will be a chain of chemical cues coming from the squid that's basically nutrients that the bacteria can swim towards and say, oh, I like the look of what's coming here. They get closer. And in the squid, there's a pore. So the juvenile squid does not have any bacteria in here, but that door is there for bacteria to enter. And it's got a bouncer. And as the bacteria come into contact, there'll be some who are supposed to be there and some who aren't. And they come in. The bouncer might be saying, oh, I do like what you've done with those proteins and sugars on your surface. I'll let you go a little bit further. To others, it might be saying, back off, Barbie, you're not dressed nicely. For the ones who do get in, they're admitted, or there's a permissive environment to let them get deeper into this developing light organ within the squid. And at that point, the door will be shut. The immune system kicks in and kills things outside. And inside, it's like you can take off your clothes now and turn into a population that's going to grow inside this light organ, and the marriage is then set. They're there and they grow, and unlike humans, they turn the lights on at that point because these particular bacteria are luminous, and they essentially, by this counter illumination that you can see in this wonderful picture here, are giving us sort of a camouflage to the squid. Now, the point of all that is to emphasize to you that this really is a permanent marriage. The adult squid has this light organ as part of its life history. It needs it to be a successful hunter and survive in the sea. And that's an organ that does not even develop in the absence of the bacteria. The process of those coming together involves a bit of give and take. It's not just the bacteria magically come in and grow. There are carrots and sticks involved. So this successful marriage actually involves cross-communication in quite elaborate levels that can involve some punishment and some reward as well to have a lifelong interaction. Now, this is something that's true for the vast majority of animals to some level or another. We've got some cases like the squid and in the legumes here with their root nodules, where it's a closed, specialized organ or room within the animal or plant that's containing a single population of bacteria. That's a monogamous marriage. Then you've got other examples that are a little bit more kinky, and you could think of it as an open marriage. And most of the mammals in our gut microbiota are a little bit like that. There is a defined organ, the gut, that's adapted to contain this complex community, but it's exposed to the external environment. So there's many, many different microbes and foods and things that are coming in as well that make that a lot more dynamic environment. Now, this concept of the holobiont is still something that's applicable for our gut microbiome because despite the fact that it's a much more open system and dynamic, by and large, it's still quite stable. Now, if I was to run around this room and ask you all to bend over and give me a poo sample, you might not like it so much, but we could store those And when you realised it wasn't that bad an experience and you came back in a month's time, you might be more willing to do it again. And if we compared those two samples, for the vast majority of us, we would still be able to see whose sample belonged to each other. So everybody has a different microbiome, it's dynamic, but it's also quite individual and it's reasonably stable over time. And that means that it is worth thinking about this thing as a part of us that's a real feature of our biology. Now, I want to tell you a very little bit now about a study that we did with a very nice Chinese group where they were looking at macaques. Apart from humans, the rhesus macaque is the most ecologically adaptable of all the primates. They live in an incredible variety of habitats. And in this particular study here, the Chinese had been able to habituate this troop of monkeys so that they could follow them and see exactly what they were eating over the course of a year. They were trained to sit on weighing balances so you could get their weight at various times. And you were able to get a really close look in a natural primate population of what happens when diets suddenly shift. Now, that's something that's happened in human societies, as Felice has just talked about, where we've moved from more traditional diets to an industrialised food chain and highly processed foods. But it's actually natural to be exposed to quite dramatic diet shifts. And here you can see that in the warmer months, these monkeys have a diet that's very heavily biased towards leaves and herbaceous plants. But in the cooler months, they're pretty much fixated on acorns. So they've got a high starch diet through this period here, and then a very high fibre diet in the other periods. So the key point here is that the microbiome is a individualised feature of us. It's reasonably stable, but it's something that also has to take part in a little bit of give and take to adapt to the environmental changes that we're going to be exposed to. Some of them will be food related, others will be other stresses such as temperature or even just getting picked on. Now that gets us to the point, if we're thinking about a holobiome where we're working together and we're going to be facing various stresses, we also need to think about the health of that interaction. Now I've got a picture here of a coral bleaching because that's something I'd imagine everybody would be reasonably familiar with. In a sense, you could think of that as an example of a dysfunctional symbiosis or a dysbiosis. The coral has kicked out its partner, and unless it re-engages with that partner, the coral will ultimately die from a situation like that. So this is an example where the interaction or the marriage has broken down with quite severe consequences for the biology of that system. Now, if we want to understand that, we've got to understand why it is that natural selection, this process that has given rise to these wonderfully intricate symbioses where the basic principle is survival of the fittest, it's gone in reverse. You've got an interaction that's having survival of the undesirable state. So if we want to understand that, we really need to have a better understanding of why it is that our bodies might go down this path to adopt a chronic state that's undesirable or worse off. And I like to think of that as exploring the biology of dumb decisions. Why is it that these associations make choices that drive them towards worse outcomes? Now, I want to give you a quick example here because it's cute. Of how microbes can influence behavioural decisions of the so-called higher organisms. These little red guys that you can see here are Japanese stink bugs. And here you can see them, the nymphs aggregating together next to the egg capsules. That's quite an elaborate behaviour that forms a part of the life cycle of those particular insects. And they look very cute, all snuggly cuddled together there, and the parents can come and look after them in a crowd like that. But you get some that get wandering behaviours and take off and don't join the crowd like they would naturally be supposed to. And what's been found in this, mostly studied in this particular bug here, but it's quite common in a number of other stink bugs that also have a requirement for establishing a symbiosis with bacteria, is that the wanderers don't have the symbiotic partner. So the presence or absence of the bacteria above a certain level in these bugs is what's giving rise to this complex behaviour of aggregating together in a creche. So microbes can have inputs to quite complex behaviours across a range of different animals. And one of the clues that comes about there for understanding the biology of dumb decisions is that the interpretation of what can be a quite simple input, in this case, it's thought to be just a couple of molecules that are produced by the bacterial symbiont, are received in the brain and give rise to this elaborate behavioural pattern. If your environmental context changes, the way in which the brain is interpreting relatively simple signals coming in can be maladaptive. So we need to understand this link between the gut, the microbes, and brain functions if we're going to understand how sensible regulation happens. And so now we're going to have a look in a little bit more detail at how the human microbiome develops and that decision-making processes come together. There's a little bit of debate about whether there's microbes colonising us in utero, but broadly speaking, although microbes can be detected in utero, the fetus is essentially not a site of active microbial growth. So the real business of microbial colonisation really only starts after birth, when you get a sudden exposure to quite large numbers of microbes. And in that period, we also have a quite distinctive diet, being milk-fed. At birth, large parts of our gut tissues, which you saw some nice diagrams from Lincon earlier, are essentially undeveloped. And that early postnatal development that commences in early infancy is where the gut immune system, which is really the body's system for managing its composition. So it's the defense and the tolerance, both the carrots and the sticks there, and also the capacity to repair any damage. So that system develops essentially after birth. The enteroendocrine system, the one that's the chemical communication system, and in particular, it plays an important role for circulating appetite hormones, develops in that window, and the enteric nervous system, which is involved not just in appetite and nutrient signaling, but also sensing of damage and the ability to recruit the immune system to go and repair. That starts in the milk-fed period. And we have that milk-fed period so that it starts when there's quite simple processes occurring. The weaning is when we're suddenly introduced to much more diverse food substrates, much more diverse antigens and chemicals that might be coming into our body, and more diverse microbes. And through that period, the crosstalk between all of these different systems and our microbes matures, and we end up with a reasonably stable individual microbiome that we have to live with for the rest of our life. Now, there's one more bit to emphasize here. That postnatal period is also one of massive central nervous system development. It's not just the size of the brain, but more importantly, it's the formation of various synaptic connections and integration with the enteric nervous system and these other components of the gut. So the brain development, or the central decision-making system, is something that happens in conjunction with the development of our own microbiome. And that means that we end up with this really profound interconnectedness between the two that impacts the way that our body maintains itself. And so now we can put this together with this idea of dysbiosis. Under normal circumstances, people will have a microbiome that's quite complex, diverse, but also there's a range of positive and negative feedbacks that maintain that composition and contribute to the homeostatic maintenance of our body. Acute disturbances, such as it might be infection, it might be a course of antibiotics, it might be a sudden loss of availability of food, or chronic stresses of various types, can both perturb that such that there's a change in the composition of the microbiome or in the physiological state of our body. Now, under normal circumstances, our brain makes good decisions to reverse that, and adaptive responses keep us back in this state. The real question that we've got in the context of these dysbiotic diseases is what's gone wrong when the body makes a poor regulatory decision that steers us on a different path to this degraded state that's undesirable, and then why are we unable to break out of it? So the idea of dysbiosis is that the interaction between the microbes and the body to maintain a normal homeostatic system has gone awry, and we've ended up with being stuck in a state that's undesirable. And we've already seen a few of these from Felice, but in essence, if you look at almost any of our chronic diseases, you will see an association with a change in what the microbiome structure will be, but you will also see that that's in conjunction with changes in the way that the regulatory systems of the body are working. And for things like obesity and type 2 diabetes, we've got dysfunction in appetite regulation, how we regulate the body's decisions to store fat or not, lack of control of inflammatory processes such that tissue repair is not working properly, and regulation of important metabolites such as glucose are dysfunctional. We see the same sorts of things in inflammatory bowel diseases, but here the emphasis is much more on the immune dysfunction. For the functional gut disorders, we may not see overt pathology in the gut, but we're experiencing or perceiving pain from down there. This is something that perhaps is more a problem with how the brain is receiving and interpreting signals from the gut rather than overt pathology there. And in the cases of mental health that we've just heard about, are there also problems there in terms of how these signals are being interpreted? So Erin is going to come on a little bit more to talk about various treatment options, but I want to just finish up with 2 quick points. The first is a quote from widely attributed to Einstein: "Keep everything as simple as possible, but no simpler than it needs to be." I would expect that many of you have seen diagrams like this talking about dysbiosis as being an issue of balancing the good bugs and the bad bugs. That's a useful and very simple way to think about how things might go wrong. And it matches this idea that when we do cross-sectional studies of obese versus lean or diabetes versus healthy, etc., we do see differences in the microbiome that show some patterns. But this is an oversimplification, because it doesn't include the host. And in a healthy marriage, you're never going to solve your problems if you only blame one partner. You've got to both accept that there's something going on. And there are very few of these diseases that can be effectively treated by saying that it's just a problem of the bugs. Add more good ones or take away bad ones. You need to take into account that a dysbiosis is fundamentally about the interaction between our system and the microbial system. So it's much more of this idea of a yin and yang thing, where you want to have a balance between the benefits for the microbes and the benefits for the host, and vice versa. So if we look at the strategies to manage this sort of thing, a fundamental one that applies to almost all of these is diet, but it's developing a diet that gives the microbes a chance to contribute something beneficial to the body. And the fundamental thing that microbes do is degrade fibre to enable us to harness energy resources from that. And the byproduct from that is something that's tightly interwoven into how many of our systems are regulated. So a diet that encourages balanced trade, has whole foods and fibre and not too much protein. We can also have some cases where we've lost microbes. The idea of bacteria therapy or replacing the missing ones is something that can be done there. In some cases, there might be a single known mechanism that's really the nub of the problem, and there may be pharmaceutical approaches that can deal with that. But the one I want to finish up with is one of the more exciting areas, is that we also need to recognise that everybody has their own individual microbiome. And that means that even if you're talking about the same type of disease, the underpinning relationship of the microbiome with that disease may not be exactly the same. So we need to recognise that one particular diet strategy or one particular drug strategy will not work the same way for everybody. And one of the things that I'm particularly excited about is this idea that we might be able to have more stratified or targeted interventions in various of these diseases by microbiome testing, but also that we might incorporate this more effectively into our regulatory bodies. At the moment, we've got effectively stipulations for randomised clinical trials for most explorations of new therapies in this space. A randomised trial effectively penalises the fact that everybody is going to be responding differently to an intervention. So stratified clinical trials is an area that might see a great leap forward in new methods to intervene in these sorts of diseases here. So, thank you.
Thanks so much for that beautiful tour through our relationships with our microbes across a range of different species. I think my partner's called me a stink bug before, actually, in a different context. All right, so our next speaker is Erin Shanahan, who's going to be talking to us about designer poop. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks Lincoln, thanks for the organisers for having me here today. So I'm Erin, I'm a research scientist based at the Charles Perkins Centre in Sydney, and my research focus is microbiome and gut health. So I work on a variety of different aspects across sort of basic science and clinical work, but today I'm going to be particularly focusing on how we're able to modify our gut microbiome. So as has been touched on by previous speakers, one of the ways that we can actually seek to change our gut microbiome if it has ended up in an undesirable or dysbiotic state is to actually provide different foods for those microbes. So the food that we eat is the food that our gut microbes eat. And so altering this is a key way of actually shifting the diversity or the makeup of or the balance of the microbial community in our gut. So obviously the foods that we eat every day, diet is a key way of doing this. Often there is a focus on prebiotics as well. So prebiotics are actually just a sort of targeted element of diet in some senses, where we're actually picking out a particular type of fibre that's going to stimulate organisms that we think are beneficial in our gut. However, feeding our microbes implies that we actually already have the microbes that we want in our gut, just not in quite the right balance. What happens if we've actually lost or never acquired some of these desirable microbes that help to make our gut and our whole body healthy? And so that's where the other key element of modifying or targeting the gut microbiome or using it as a therapeutic comes in. And this is where we actually want to try and add new microbes or change the makeup of the microbial community by adding in microbes from a new source. So this can happen in various ways. It can happen through probiotics. So this can actually occur even through the consumption of fermented foods, which contain microbes, through actual probiotic formulations, where you're giving individual or a defined mixture of particular microbes that are thought to have health benefits. And then the sort of most, I guess, extreme in some ways version of this is to actually go all the way and do a whole transplant of a new microbiome into someone's gut. And that's what a fecal transplant essentially involves. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on in the rest of this talk. So what is a fecal microbiome transplant? It's talked about a lot. It's very popular in the media. There's lots of blogs and wonderful stories about fecal microbiome transplants solving all sorts of problems. But I want to talk a little bit about what it actually is and where there is good clinical evidence for treating disease. So essentially this refers to the transfer of fecal material from one individual to another. So we start with some donor feces, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And essentially this would be sort of mixed and homogenized and filtered in some way, and then provided to a recipient. Now this material can be provided in various different ways. It can be incorporated into a capsule and taken orally. It can be provided by a tube or an endoscope, sort of going down into the gut from the top, or you can go up the other way and administer this material straight into the colon, depending on where you want things to end up and the best method for the different cohort of patients that you might be working with. So this happens after what's called some bowel preparation as well. So it doesn't just sort of generally go straight in on top of what's already there. Often the bowel will be prepared through trying to sort of clear out what might already exist in terms of microbes, drinking solutions that sort of help to wash everything out, providing an environment that's actually sort of ready for this whole new microbial community to arrive. So in terms of finding the feces that we want. This is actually quite a complicated aspect of fecal microbiome transplant. And it's one of the things that really needs, it's an area of key interest and it needs a lot of work to really start to get fecal microbiome transplant as something that's used more common clinically. So when we have or try to identify, our donor wish list or our ideal donor for some feces, we want to answer or tick a whole lot of boxes. We want that person to be healthy, no infections, a lot of screening needs to happen. You can think about it in a similar way to some of the blood screening that might occur, where we're looking to see that, nothing bad is going to be transferred across. Ideally, you would probably want that donor to be having a healthy diet, all of the features that we've just heard about from the previous speakers, so that they've got that optimal diverse microbiome that's going to do wonderful things when it comes into the next person's body. So these are all the things that we look for. Now, in some cases, and particularly in some of the earlier clinical trials, it's been an individual who's donated their fecal material, and sometimes trials are lucky enough to find these super donors who tick all of these boxes. They're the ideal donor and do great. Their stool does great things when it goes into all of the recipients. But finding that perfect donor is challenging. And what the field is moving more towards now is actually creating stool banks where there's a variety of material that's available from different individuals. It's curated, it's screened, it's stored very carefully. This is happening, all over the world. It's happening here in Victoria. I think Felice can probably talk about a little bit more about that in the question time as well. To really start to provide, a great resource of fecal material that we think is going to have optimal effects. However, having a great sort of ideal, perfect fecal donor or a bank of this sort of ideal, diverse microbiome material is not so easy to achieve. And that's because the microbiome is really complex. And as we've heard from previous speakers, the interaction between our microbes and our body and the environmental influences are also really complicated. And so these complex interactions can make it really difficult to determine, well, what is the ideal microbiome? And is that ideal microbiome ideal for everyone or ideal for every disease state? And so this is some of the really important research questions that are still being asked, where one microbiome sort of state may be beneficial in certain circumstances or for certain individuals. This might differ. And so this is a really sort of key area of research that's ongoing. So can fecal transfers actually be used to treat disease? So if the gut microbiome plays a causative role in disease or is an important part of those feedback loops between our immune system, our metabolism, our gut microbes, our nervous system, if it's involved in that feedback loop, then altering the microbiome does offer a means of potential treatment. And when you think about all of those aspects to disease and the feedback loops that have been touched on before, the microbiome is one of the most readily modified aspects. So we can modify it through diet, we can modify it through fecal transfer. And so it is a really exciting area in terms of being able to break some of these sort of dysbiotic feedback loops that are causing chronic disease that are really hard to treat currently. So there's all sorts of potential for targeting the microbiome and fecal transplant, whether it's gut disorders themselves, infection, inflammatory disorders, but also further afield. So metabolic disorders, obviously anything involved in sort of gut-brain axis, the microbiome plays a key role there. And other things that we may not initially think of, but involve particularly the immune system. So again, metabolic disorders, the treatment of cancer, immunotherapies, theoretically, are targets for fecal transplant and are the subject of ongoing trials. However, disease can be very complex, as I've just touched on. And I just wanted to, as I sort of move towards the end here, work through the different types of disorders that fecal microbiome transplant has been used or investigated in, and why some of those different disorders, we're sort of further or not as far along the path of actually implementing fecal transfer. And it relates to the complexity of the disease. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is a gut infection. And there's a particular gut infection that often occurs, particularly after some repeated antibiotic exposure, called Clostridium difficile infection, or C. difficile. And some people might have heard of this before. It's quite prevalent in sort of Western countries, associated with the sort of disturbance or dysbiosis of the gut microbiome. And this infection can be chronic. It's very hard to treat. It can be recurring. The prior sort of frontline treatments have been antibiotics to try and get rid of this infection, but it recurs. It's been very difficult to treat. The frontline treatment now for C. difficile is, in many cases, a fecal microbiome transplant, especially for patients who've had recurrent infections. It's got a very high level of clinical evidence for efficacy or working well. And so in terms of fecal microbiome transplant, this is the sort of disorder or the disease that we're furthest down the pathway. This works. It works. It's a great treatment in this disorder. And what I want to highlight here is that this is a gut infection, and it's primarily centered around a microbiome disturbance. So there's been a disruption to the normal functioning of the microbial community in the gut. And so we're able to come in with a fecal transplant and fix that up. As we move into the more complex disorders, where you've got involvement of immune feedbacks, metabolic feedbacks, gut-brain axis, you're starting to get all of these different elements coming into play, very complex feedback loops occurring. It's more complex to treat, and the role of the microbiome is less clear in the sense that it's not happening in isolation. So the more of these feedback loops and other complex elements to the disease, the more difficult it is to be able to just change the microbiome or know how to change the microbiome to fix things up. And so for these other disorders, we are not as far down the sort of clinical pathway, or the clinical evidence from things like randomized controlled trials is not yet as strong. It doesn't mean that there's not great promise in these fields. One of the other ones I haven't mentioned here is the cancer treatment that Felice touched on as well. But they're more complex, so there's more work to do, but it's a very exciting area. And so, as I said, for something that's really centered around microbiome disturbance sort of in and of itself, it's in clinical practice. Things where we've got some immune and microbiome disturbances, we're starting to get good evidence from clinical trials. As things become more complex, clinical trials are ongoing. It's a really exciting area, but there is more work to do. And it's due to the complexity of these disorders. However, when we think about the different elements that contribute to these disorders, altering the microbiome, altering diet, they're the most modifiable factors. And so I think they're the most exciting aspects to target. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up. So I think fecal microbiome transplant and the other ways of modulating the microbiome that I haven't spent so much time on, are key ways that we can leverage this modifiable aspect of our body system. There's potential to treat lots of different disorders where the microbiome is involved, but the complexity of the microbiome, the individual variation between people, the fact that the microbiome can have different sort of stable states across different individuals makes it challenging. But there is, it's a really exciting area, and I think we're going to be hearing more and more about it into the future. One thing I will touch on, but don't have much time to talk about, are, some of those regulatory and logistical hurdles. Is a fecal microbiome transplant, is it a drug? Do you regulate it as a drug? How do you regulate, is it more like a blood donation? What are all the screenings that we need? So there's lots to talk about there. But yeah, we're going to be hearing more and more about this, and more evidence, I think, is coming through from the clinical trials that are currently running and will be running in the near future. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Erin, for the amazing talk. So this is going to be really interesting now, because 87% of you said yes before the talk. So I'm going to see which way it sways you. If anyone still has the app open, jump on and vote. We're a little bit behind, so let's do it at double digits this time. Now that you've sat through this lecture, if you're advised by a doctor that you needed poo transplant, what would you say? 80%, yes, okay, thereabouts, about the same. Alrighty. So I just want to finish up the formalities, and then we're going to get the three speakers up the front for some panel question time. But I really want to first acknowledge the local organising committee for this public lecture: Heidi, Rebecca, Jess, Marlene, and also myself. We did an amazing job. It was a lot of work to pull together, but we're so excited to see all you guys here and everyone online so interested in gut health, and that's really exciting. And finally, also just again to acknowledge our sponsors. As I said, this lecture is brought to you by the Australian Neurogastroenterology and Motility Association, and it's sponsored by the School of Biomedical Sciences at the University of Melbourne, Deakin University Impact, Monash Institute of Pharmaceutical Sciences, and also by Bayer. So I will stop that presentation there. And I'll ask all the speakers if they don't mind coming up and sitting at the front for me. All right, so we're going to have some roaming microphones. So just chuck your hand up in the audience if you have a question, and we will find you.
Whilst the roving mic is finding a person in the audience to ask a question, we're filtering the questions that are coming in from online over here. So we have a first question that is relevant to the global pandemic that we've all just lived through. Do you think dysbiosis has a role in long COVID, and could improving gut microbiome be a treatment option? And does anybody know of any research into the gut microbiome and COVID? Open to anybody.
I can probably answer this one. I'm an editor for a journal, and from almost the first case of COVID, weekly we were getting requests, can we submit a paper on the idea that the microbiome might be influencing this? There hasn't been a lot of papers that have really come out yet that have greatly illuminated things. There's a couple of quite interesting ones. I guess the short answer would be that you could think of any of these post-infection sequelae as being examples of dysbiosis. So long COVID, we think, is more common just because it's been so much more closely captured. But things like Guillain-Barré syndrome is probably one that most of the people who are doing medicine will have seen in the textbooks. And essentially, if your immune system is predisposed to lock into an antigen and gets confused in the course of an infection, such that it's then targeting something from your own body, you can end up with a long-term, effectively an autoimmune disorder, of which long COVID will be like that. But beyond that, mechanisms still poorly known.
Are there any questions from the audience? Yeah, just here.
Testing, hello. Hi everyone, thank you for the talks, really, really interesting. So my question relates to an analogy brought up. So when our microbiome is first developed, there's a suggestion that, there's like a bouncer saying that some microbes can stay and be in part of the symbiosis and maybe some can't. So then my question is, so with the fecal transplants, do we think that this bouncer is still there, and whether you are transplanting a different microbiome, whether this bouncer would just still reject those microbes, or does this bouncer change throughout life, for example?
Yes, this is what I can do. So great question. I think the short answer is yes. The longer version of that answer is we don't quite understand all the mechanisms. So a couple of sort of elements to that. One of the things that I didn't touch on is, I talked about sort of preparing the bowel for the transfer. One of the aspects that is sort of under current investigation is also whether you need to modify or modulate the immune system at that same time. So whether some sort of immunosuppression at that time would allow for better engraftment of the new microbiome that you're transferring. So the immune system is one important element of, or acts as one of the bouncers in our gut system. The other element there is, the sort of the gut system. So we think of it as a niche, so an area where certain microbes are able to survive, and whether that is different between different individuals and therefore allows different microbes to colonize, remainders of the existing microbiome, do they sort of facilitate or block new colonization? So yeah, I think there are still bouncers there. And one of the things that is really clear from the clinical trials into microbiome transfer is that it doesn't engraft into everyone. We don't know exactly why, but it's a really important thing to investigate. And we do see that it's the people that it does engraft well into that are the ones that have the positive clinical outcome. So.
If I could follow on a little bit from that, you started with the example that I gave. It's important to recognise there's a distinction between the microbes getting into a site that's started sterile or is normally sterile. In that case, the immune system is really the defender of that site, and you've got a very, very tight constraint on who's allowed in and who's not. When you're talking about something like the gut or the skin, they're normally exposed to microbes, and the biggest defenders are actually the microbes that are already there, the resident microbes, and this term colonisation resistance is the one that's applied to that. And I'll also say that there's a little bit of an argument in the field about whether we should call these fecal microbial transplants or fecal bacteriotherapy, because as Erin mentioned, it's actually not really a transplant. It's live bacteria that are inducing a change, so they're the source of the therapy, and some of them certainly do get there, but it's not real swapsies. There's other things going on. So fecal therapy is a more all-pervasive term.
That's a great question.
Just very quickly on that. So in terms of doing the fecal microbial transplant, do you screen for viruses, and are things sort of taken out that you know are bad before they go in?
So, do you want to?
I mean, I'm guessing they are.
Yeah. So I work with Lifeblood, which is the National Blood Bank. They now have a national stool bank. And one of the challenges, I think, in terms of getting this into clinical practice is, well, it all comes down to money. Firstly, we need investment in randomised controlled trials. So we've been talking to the government in Victoria to try and get funding. We've just run a feasibility trial in major depressive disorder. We want to get funding for a fully powered trial in major depression. St Vincent's, they're wanting to do this in IBD, and then another group are wanting to do this in cancer. It's so important that we do these trials, but they are super expensive. Even though poo is essentially free, the process of finding the donor is so laborious and so expensive that each dose is several $1,000s. Only about 3% of potential donors actually make the cut. The screening process is very intense. They look at so many different, potential pathogens, even things like COVID that can live in the stool. genes that are resistant to antibiotics, you know, serious antibiotic resistant genes. There's so many things that have to be screened for, and so few people actually make it through, and that's why it's so expensive. And then you've got the delivery too. If you're giving someone a colonoscopy, for example, that's surgery, hospital costs, all the rest of it. The feasibility trial that we just did was with enemas. And people had to come in 4 days in a row and get 4 enemas. Now, the hope would be that we could make a product available that has needs fewer enemas, but people could actually do it at home, because that would then be, of course, a way of cutting down the costs. So there's all sorts of challenges. They are often about money. If you're really keen on this, please do contact your local member and ask for more funding for medical research. I mean, when we did our feasibility trial, we only had, it was just 15 people. We had within a few days about 160 people just on the waiting list wanting to get into this. Now, this talks to the huge unmet need of people living with major depression that's not fully treated or not treated at all. But also the appetite, so to speak, for this approach. There's huge potential here, but we need to do the research to know, like, how much poo, from whom, who benefits, how many doses do you need, what's the best method of administration. So huge amount of research needs to be done, and it's certainly very much in its early days at the moment.
I'll just quickly add that another angle that's being actively pursued by a number of groups is to deal with precisely that issue of safety and medical insurance, and that's autologous poo donation. In other words, you would bank your own poo now while you're healthy, store it in a fridge somewhere so that it's available for you to have your own personalised chocolate smoothie later in life when you might need it. And that bypasses a lot of the issues around insurance, and you're only responsible for your own safety there, but we're likely to run into a poo storage problem with that if everybody did it.
Yeah, we have that problem already.
Just up the back here on the right.
Just wondering, with like the gut infections, when Erin was talking about it, just your take on the Helicobacter treatment. Because I know currently it's like 3 doses of antibiotics, but then wouldn't that leave you prone for infection again? And your take on PPIs as well for gut problems.
So, great question. So, any sort of repeated antimicrobial treatment, particularly one that's actually targeting the organisms that might be in the gut, in that case, obviously further up in the gut, but is going to have a potentially detrimental effect to what's happening in the microbial community, because we're sort of indiscriminately coming in and wiping out various things. And you know, that is a key challenge of antimicrobial therapy, and what to do about it. And there have been trials of things like fecal microbiome transplant, post heavy antibiotic therapies, and other, you know, probiotics, prebiotics, with very sort of mixed results so far. And so it's, you know, it's a real challenge, and I wish I had a clearer answer there. The other aspect is the PPIs, and that's a really interesting question. So the PPIs reduce the sort of acid content in our stomach and sort of first part of the small intestine. And that actually, so that acid, as well as helping to digest food, also is an important mechanism for preventing access to the gut from different microbes that we're exposed to from the environment and potential infections, and also even just our oral microbiome. And what is actually seen with PPI use is that you get, people can be more susceptible to some gut infections, and you also get a higher level of microbes that are typically found in our mouth, found in the gut, including in the large bowel. And there's a lot of research going on into whether that is potentially having some detrimental effects. So, you know, targeting, you know, what we think is targeting just the stomach or the upper GI tract potentially has some important implications for sort of our whole gut system. And it's definitely an active area of research.
Another one from the audience, then we might take one online.
Thank you. Sorry. Wonderful talk. It was amazing learning about all of this. I'm currently studying some cancers like gastric cancer, and also have done some previous studies in psychology. And I'm just wondering, diet is briefly mentioned when you learn about these. It's not really considered overly significant in any of the lectures you receive about it. My question's kind of aimed towards Felice. What is your hope for the future of, like, if someone goes to a GP saying, I think I've got depression, what do you want the response to be? Do you still want, what's the pathway basically?
Look, it's a great question, and it's one where we're really active. Even though this is not incentivised or rewarded by medical research funding bodies, we do a lot of work around education and training. So we set up a free online course in nutritional psychiatry that is one of the most popular now in the world. It's enrolled more than 78,000 people from more than 180 countries, which really just points to the interest in this field. We've recently launched an accredited training for psychiatrists and other medical practitioners that's informed and endorsed by the Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists. And really excitingly, that Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists have, in their most recent set of clinical practice guidelines, put what is essentially lifestyle medicine as the foundation of treatment for mood disorders. So basically what they say is, before you do anything else, you need to help your patient to achieve a healthy diet, more physical activity, better sleep, etc. But there's a huge translation gap because, as I said, most practitioners get no training in it, and it's still very new for a lot of people. We've recently published, just in the last 3 or 4 weeks, the first set of international guidelines for lifestyle-based care and mental health treatment. We're hoping that that will really inform more changes to clinical practice and guidelines around the world. So we hope and expect that over the next 5 years, things will change. We've also just completed a very important real-world trial to look at whether diet and exercise support from clinical dietitians, exercise physiologists, is at least as effective as psychotherapy, which is a gold standard treatment. And we've done this in people through the COVID pandemic, where we very high levels of psychological distress. The question is not, is one better than the other? But given that there are huge waiting lists to see psychologists at the moment, many, many months at least, we want to be able to give, a sense of security to clinicians, for them to be able to say to their patients, look, while you're waiting, how about you see a dietitian? How about you start to think about diet and movement more? The results of that trial are super exciting, and I'm not going to reveal them, but they are very, I think will be very, very impactful. And we've also just started a big national trial of the same thing to look in primary care, because we know a huge proportion of people who go to the doctor do so because of their mental health symptoms. And so, again, we want to be able to answer that question for doctors. Can I safely get my patients to go and see a dietitian and or exercise physiologist, as well as, or while they're waiting to see a psychologist? And is it cost effective? So all of this will hopefully inform changes to guidelines, changes to clinical practice, changes to Medicare, which is a really big issue. There is no funding mechanism for people with a mental health problem to go and see a dietitian. What they have is access to 10 subsidised treatments with the psychologist, which has turned out to be very, very expensive for the government because there was so much need that they didn't anticipate. But again, we don't have the workforce, the mental health workforce, to take up that need. So we really need to train other parts of the workforce, the allied health professionals, to work with people with mental disorders. So all of this is part of what we're doing at the Food and Mood Centre. Most of it is not funded. We're doing it through other, scraping together bits of money here, there and everywhere. Some of it's funded. The big effectiveness trials are funded. So it's a really important thing, but I think we've gone a long way, given it's only been 12 years since the first real studies in nutritional psychiatry have been published. The fact that we are already informing clinical guidelines, high-level policy. I mean, the WHO's new mental health report, for the first time, lists unhealthy diet as a risk factor for mental disorders. This is really important. And I have to say, it's largely on the basis of the work that we've led and the activism that we engage in and the psychom to try and get people thinking about their, you know, what they put in their mouth and how it might be relevant to their mental and brain health. What we also see at the public health point of view is that the messaging around diet for the last 2 decades has been around obesity. That's just been a disaster. I mean, it's stigmatizing. People really struggle to lose weight or to keep it off. There's obesity, an incredibly complex condition. And so people give up if they think, well, I can't lose weight or I can't keep it off. When people understand this very concrete connection between what they eat and their mental health, it leverages behaviour change. If you make it even more concrete and you say you put food in your mouth, within hours, your gut is dealing with that and producing all these thousands of molecules that are driving all these systems in your body, and you can change this really quickly, that prompts behaviour change. And this is what the trials are showing. So I think that that's a much more fruitful way of getting the message across, is to concentrate on this. So there's a lot to be done, but we're making good headway, I think.
That's a fantastic question. We'll take an online question from Dr. Heidi, and then we've got an in-person question just up here.
One here, a couple actually around the same sort of topic, probably for Erin or Andrew, around for the everyday person sitting at home listening to this, now concerned about their microbiome, should they be purchasing a microbiome testing kit?
Do you want to answer that?
I don't think anybody should be purchasing their own microbiome testing kit, but there are a number of companies out there that are doing this sort of thing now. And it's getting to the point where it is within reach of many people as a cost. The issue with it at the moment, though, is that it's not a recognised diagnostic test for almost anything at the moment. Now, that might sound a little bit discouraging. So I actually touch back on the question that came before with where can you integrate diet into therapies or interventions? And there's no doubt, as you've heard from Felice, that diet can have very readily implemented and beneficial effects in people. But the other thing that we repeatedly see with diet is that not everybody responds the same way. And this is where the microbiome testing is starting to have some leverage and some potential starting to be seen. That when you deeply phenotype, so you're not just collecting microbiome, but you're also collecting diet data and metabolic responses, sometimes immune profiles as well, then using artificial intelligence and machine learning type programs, we're starting to see quite impressive abilities to predict what someone's response to diet might be. Now, at the moment, those sorts of things are not quite at the level where they would be clinically acceptable. So 80 or 90% accuracy is not what you need for a diagnostic test. But that's certainly at the level where we can say that there's a lot of potential for this to be able to streamline or target these sorts of interventions. And a good example of that is the Mediterranean diet. It's something that's very widely seen as a healthy diet. If you were to focus on that, just looking at cardiometabolic risk factors, then the Mediterranean diet is something that can significantly reduce those factors for many people, but not all. And a very recent paper that came out in Nature Medicine found that one of the strongest indicators of whether it would be successful or not was a quite simple association with one particular bacterium in the gut microbiome, the Prevotella copri. Now, again, that's not quite at the level of a diagnostic test, but what it's pointing to is that we're now seeing potential for ways in which you might do cheap, affordable tests for people that could be rolled out to more effectively target who's going to benefit from these types of diets, and there's the potential to have quite a big impact in things like immunotherapy responses and so forth.
I just wanted to make another brief comment on that and getting tested. So one of the other elements of doing one of these personal tests is that often these companies will actually, they're building databases of information, and obviously, you give permissions and things when you agree to do the test. But the more people who actually get their microbiome tested, the more information we have about the variety of different microbes that are out there and the different assemblages of or different communities of microbes and how they all fit together in someone's microbiome. And so I would actually say, it's not ready as a diagnostic, but a more altruistic advantage or benefit of doing these tests is that you're actually contributing to that body of knowledge about what is the normal healthy microbiome, what is the range of different microbiomes that are out there in the world, and all of that comes back to inform then all of the research and then eventually clinical practice. So I think that's also a kind of a nice aspect to it as well.
And I'll just add to that to say that we're doing quite a lot of work around this personalised nutrition area, and understanding what works for whom under what circumstances is really important. And these new approaches to data and big data and AI are yielding all sorts of interesting insights. We work a lot with a company called Microba up in Queensland, who very, from a scientific point of view, very rigorous. Andy and I were both in a 3-part Catalyst series some years back, where we used those early versions of their reports. People can probably watch that on iView if they're interested. But the new series that's just started with Magda and her health, I forget what it's called, just started this week. I was part of that, and the 3rd episode also includes a Microba report, which is a lot more sophisticated than it was, and discussing it. So if you're interested, you could have a look at that. And the only reason I would bring up their name, and sort of, it sounds like I'm promoting them, it's more that there's a lot of other companies out there who are not doing it very rigorously. So if you're going to do it, just go with a good reputable company. And I would say that Microba is a good one to do that with.
Great advice. We might take one more in person, then we'll grab a couple more online. Just up here at the back on the left.
Yeah, I was wondering, to what degree do you think adults acquire new organisms for their gut via the food they eat? And related to that, eating raw food that's not sterile versus cooked food, which is more sterile, is that a relevant factor in all of this?
Andy, are you able to answer that at all? Otherwise, I might even throw to Heidi. You might have an idea.
Yeah,
Put you on the spot.
the short answer is, as an adult, if you're healthy and you've not had any dramatic disturbance to your gut, it's remarkably stable. You don't really take too many new things in. There's a little bit of continual turnover, but it's not dramatic. If you went on a really extreme sort of diet, so if you completely excluded fiber, let's say you went full Eskimo, then you really are going to have a dramatic turnover of organisms there. But under most normal circumstances, that's not really going to be the case. Probably the one that people might most commonly come across would be the various versions of a ketogenic diet have become quite popular for a number of things. It's particularly being explored for treatment of epilepsy. The ketogenic diets are the sort of thing that have very, very low fiber, still reasonable amounts of protein and high fat. And they're the ones that there are issues with staying on that for too long for precisely that reason.
All right, we might grab a couple of questions online from Marlene Howe.
There's people who are very interested in asking whether there are any benefits from commercially available probiotics.
To the recipient or to the company selling them? So that was a slightly flippant answer, but there are probiotics that have been really quite robustly shown to deliver benefits, but they are almost all of the ones that have got the most robust evidence for them are in really quite specific applications where it's treating a defined condition. The vast majority that you see on the shelves of health stores and things like that are being marketed as a general well-being sort of thing. They're safe. They may very well have some beneficial effect in some people, but as a broad principle, a probiotic is what we would call an augmentation strategy. You're adding something that's supposedly missing. So you can't get any benefit from a probiotic unless you are missing what it gives in the first case. So for most healthy people, you're healthy because you're already getting that factor. So it's where you've got a specific disease and it's validated, and that's then a different question to the.
Thanks, Andrew. Marley, another one from online, then we'll grab one in person.
Another question is, do pesticides or insecticides in contemporary Western food production have an impact on the gut microbiome?
We would imagine so, yes. But again, it's such early days and the research is so limited that I don't know that that's been fully characterised, but almost certainly. I mean, everything interacts with the microbiome. What I think is interesting is that, for example, antibiotics can act sometimes as antidepressants, whereas antidepressants are often acting as antimicrobials. Virtually, I mean, you think about your gut microbiome as your organ of adaptation, and everything that you ingest interacts with it. And there's some suggestion and some early evidence that it might be your organ of detoxification, for example, to help you get rid of persistent organic pollutants that you might be exposed to. So it's just another reason to keep your gut microbiota in as good a condition as possible, because if it's got to deal with all these pesticides and all these nasty things that are in the environment, you want it to be in top-notch condition. But there's so much we don't know. I mean, we still don't have any idea about what all these persistent organic pollutants are doing. You know, they're barely studied, and when they are, they're only studied in isolation. They're not looked at in terms of how they interact with each other and with the host. So we just don't know.
All right, we're running a little bit over time already, so we might just grab one more question in person here.
Thanks. I'm a yoga therapist, and so I'm not taking the kind of microbial point of view as much. Digestive health is my main focus. So I'm looking at the host, and I really love that there's, you know, there's the small and then there's the larger host perspective, the person. And I'm wondering, because there was a diagram of all the things that will affect gut health, and something that might not have been in that list was breathing, which I'm not doing right now, and how incredibly important that is for gut health from a yoga therapy point of view. So it would be things like basically the diaphragm creating the motility of digestion, the constant movement moving through the blood flow that will go down into the area. Then there's just, you know, really good breath, full diaphragmatic breath, creating the parasympathetic nervous system to come online. And, you know, if you're interested in that whole vagus nerve concept, that ventral, vagal, kind of rest, digest, socialize aspect, and even how important it is to have company when you eat, how that might put us onto a ventral vagal parasympathetic kind of place. And then alongside that is the saliva, you know, that will come out because you're in a parasympathetic state, you know. So when I see clients, that's the perspective I take. And it was really amazing that someone asked about PPIs and the other antacids, because, you know, I've got a client who she has been taking them for 15 years and has currently got some bad side effects from it. And instantly, as a yoga therapist, looking at the whole person, from the moment that I had her as a client, I could see there was zero movement of her diaphragm. She had a postural position of being closed. And so these are the sort of connections that
I really do agree that this is really important. Unfortunately, at this point, there's very little scientific evidence. It hasn't been studied. So this is why it doesn't make its way onto those sorts of figures. I think we know that for people with IBS, for example, hypnotherapy is a really important treatment. About 90% of the signals between the gut and the brain go from the gut to the brain, about 10% from the brain to the gut. Tackling things from whether it's relaxation, whether it's yoga, mindfulness, there's all sorts of things that can affect that stress response system and the gut and the way it behaves. And it's a really ripe area for scientific investigation. But at this point, there is not a huge amount of research that's been done. So this is another area where I think we need to do more research.
Yeah, I could comment a little bit further. So that one of the challenges for doing it with people is that, let's call them lifestyle conscious people typically have got multiple different factors that will make them different from others. So it's hard to specifically test what the effects of the yoga or something like that might be, and you can't train mice to do it, so you can't do it in an animal experiment. But we can draw some more broader parallels to say that there are some known mechanisms now whereby those sorts of broader lifestyle factors do have an effect. The two really obvious ones are exercise and the periodicity of your eating, intermittent fasting, etc. Both of those change the way in which nutrients and the subsequent metabolites are going to be both absorbed and distributed around your body. So longer fasting periods, basically there's almost two workforces of microbes. There's those that engage directly with what you eat, and there's those that work on the sequels of that and that come to the front during the fasting periods. And so longer gaps between your meal changes the way that your body works. Exercise and I would imagine also breathing practices would come into this, change the blood flow patterns, and it's the blood that's exporting microbial metabolites from the gut via the liver to the rest of the body. And so anything, be it exercise or breathing patterns that changes that, does have an effect on the relationship between diet, microbes and whole physiology. Both of those are things that have been seen.
And very excitingly, the big trial that I mentioned, the real life trial where we're looking at diet and exercise support versus psychotherapy, we've actually taken poo samples. So we're actually going to be able to look at some of these things. You know, do people increase their exercise? What are potentially synergistic results of changing both things? There's all sorts of things that it's really exciting to find out how things might be working, but gee, there's a lot to do still. But I do think that breathing as a mechanism for improving health and reducing stress, incredibly important, incredibly interesting. We just need more research.
All right, I've been rubber-armed into one more online question. Heidi?
Yeah, the really critical question here is, do the panel members all eat a high fibre, high plant-based diet?
I do.
Pull my finger.
We also really like poo jokes. Well, I don't know, Andy and I do anyway.
Yes.
All right, well.
We try to.
Okay, sorry to interrupt. Well, I guess we're running a little bit over time, so a little bit conscious of the time, and we're actually physically getting kicked out of here at 7:30. But please join me in firstly thanking our three amazing panelists.
Thanks so much for inviting us.
It's been a really wonderful talk, and we're so excited to see so many of you in person or online who are interested in gut health. And I echo Felice's message. If you are interested and excited and you think the gut health and gut research is important, please contact your local member and tell them how important you think research is in Australia. And with that, I think we'll just wrap it up. And thank you everyone again, online and in person.